find some peace of mind. Father said you'll be sorry, son, if you leave your home this way. And when you realize the freedom money buys, you'll come running home someday.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the second part of our introduction in post-communist transition, and welcome to what I actually have to say is going to be one of my favorite lectures to give. And I know that this is right in the beginning here, but this is something that I've been thinking about really for a long time. And that is really assessing the legacy of 1989. Right? It's a very pivotal year in which most of the countries of Eastern, Central, and Southeastern Europe overthrew their single-party authoritarian communist states. And even though the Soviet Union lasted for about another 2 years or so, we kind of euphemistically just considered 1989, right, to be that major year in which these third-wave transition countries that I mentioned in the previous lecture, and one successive communist state after another just collapsed. And, you know, those of us that wanted to figure out what was going on turned on the CBS Evening News or CNN or ABC or, NBC, whatever it is, whether it was Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, whoever. We were, I have to say, surprisingly caught off guard to see how fast and how collective public dissension was in countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and Poland, right? Countries that we thought were, closed off for the indefinite future. Countries that might have had, diaspora communities living in Western Europe and the United States who never ceased to miss a moment to tell us how bad things were in their home countries. And so for a series of revolutions that very quickly topped one government after another, this was kind of seen as a major cathartic moment for us, right? It was the, for better or for worse, whether it's true or not, the defeat of communism, right? The defeat of Marxism, of socialism, and the triumph of American-led capitalism. So, by way of this sort of, long roundabout introduction, I mean, this is kind of the narrative that I want to take in this particular lecture. And, the rundown of this discussion, I feel that we really, really, really need to examine the nature and the function of single-party communist regimes in Eastern Europe, as early or as late, however way you want to look at it, by 1985. And I choose 85 because it really is the year that the Soviet Union begins to make some notable changes, right? This is the year of Mikhail Gorbachev. This is the year in which the Soviet Union finally realizes that political and economic and structural reforms are absolutely necessary. And at the risk of giving away one of the major plot lines of the discussion here, I will say right off the bat that one of the reasons for the comparatively peaceful transition to power in most of these countries, and also one of the reasons why these governments collapsed so quickly as they did, is due in no small part to the previous diplomacy of Mikhail Gorbachev. A lot of times people in the United States will attribute the collapse of communism to the political acumen of Ronald Reagan. That, I think, is rather erroneous. If anything, if someone deserves the credit for the way in which things happened the way that they did, it's more Gorbachev than Reagan. But, we'll get to that, in due time. Along the way, I also want to examine the capabilities present and the options available for public protest and dissension by 1988, right? 1 year before things started. In this sense, I want to examine what degrees of, let's say, moderation, right? How, let's say, some authoritarian regimes already began to roll back some of the more severe or draconian degrees of oppression and state control. So, with this sense, the nature of authoritarian control has a significant influence on the types of protests and also the targets of said protest. A third thing I want to look at in this discussion is the West's response to what was happening, particularly by November of '89. The West, and here, once again, I have to say the West euphemistically, West Germany, the UK, France, the United States. We don't really start paying a lot of attention until the Berlin Wall incident here. That's really when we start taking this stuff seriously. But by November, right, Poland had already transitioned into a multi-party, emerging democracy. Hungary had just kind of transitioned itself from, bureaucratic authoritarianism into some kind of more benign social democracy. So it really wasn't until the East German events that took place. Because I guess by that point, right, when the Berlin Wall opens, and that's our CNN moment, we realize that we've reached the point of no return. But to this, I want to add not just when we responded, but what we perceived was going on. And that, kind of leads back to the narratives that I was giving beforehand, in which were these public protests across Central and Southeastern Europe anti-socialist or anti-authoritarian? And this is important to note, because if we accept that these protests were anti-communist, right, anti-Marxist, anti-socialist, then it, assumes that the public rejected all notions of the social welfare state, of workers' rights, of the ability to unionize. And even though there's absolutely no proof at all that these social protests were of that nature, it was kind of just sort of assumed. It was just sort of a leap of faith almost within much of the opinion columns of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, in the West, that what we saw was what we wanted to see, right? Particularly with the removal of statues of Lenin and Stalin and Dzerzhinsky and, other, major Soviet officials, the tumbling down of these statues, the renaming of cities like, from Leningrad back to St. Petersburg, or the renaming of Karl-Marx-Stadt back to Chemnitz, or the reunification of Germany between East and West. It was very tempting, and, no one really called us out on it in suggesting that this was really a referendum on socialism. Now, if we were to assume that this was more just a public reckoning of authoritarianism, a larger and more broader concept of that, well, that might help us understand why a number of countries that we previously assumed would be, success stories in transitioning, are now kind of taking a step or two back into some form of illiberal populism. And, one step at a time here, but, this is important for us to understand, because if we get 1989 wrong, we may end up getting 2021 wrong as well. Okay? So that's the rundown of what we're going to be looking at, and also something that we will be examining in detail next week in Central Europe, and even the following week when we look at the Balkans. If we examine the map of the so-called post-communist world in 1989, it's rather simplistic. There were, just a handful of countries in Eastern Europe, as well as this big monolith of the Soviet Union. And as I had mentioned in the previous lecture, up until, March or April of 1989, the general prognosis in the West was what you see right here is what's going to stay for the indefinite future, right? East Germany is going to be East Germany, Soviet Union is going to be the Soviet Union. The only country that might, be kind of giving us some entertaining development is Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia was kind of in a world of its own. It was communist, it was single-party authoritarian, but it was the most dynamic, the most flexible. It produced the highest quality of living within the post-communist world. So, if you kind of, woke up in a world and found out that you had to spend your life in a communist country, and you found out that it was Yugoslavia, you could do a hell of a lot worse. It was not all that bad. But obviously, things have changed since then, right? 30 years later, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia both ceased to exist, along with East Germany, which was absorbed into West Germany to just create Germany. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Albania are all still there. Czechoslovakia broke into two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Yugoslavia breaks up into 6 succeeding republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. 7 if you count the disputed territory of Kosovo. But this lecture kind of goes on the premise that if you ain't in the UN, you ain't a country. So I know that, it is what it is here. But when it comes to the Soviet Union as well, right? The much feared big, anti-American bugaboo basically dissolves at the end of 1991. Before we knew it, we woke up one morning and suddenly kablooey, it was done. The whole country just broke up peacefully, for the most part, into 15 succeeding republics. So, the events that give us this momentous period really take place almost exclusively in Central and Southeastern Europe. Obviously, with the Soviet Union collapsing in 1991, it's, the big epic finale here. But if we were to pick a date of when things began, and, I want to emphasize again that when this happened, the Polish Roundtable Agreement of April the 4th, it may have made international headlines, but it wasn't really seen as a major watershed moment, despite the fact that the Roundtable Agreement was really an agreement between the increasingly entrenched Communist Party apparatchiks and an increasingly emboldened and empowered civic social opposition movement called Solidarity. And, at a virtual, literal roundtable in which, all members agree to sit down and talk about the future of the country, an agreement is reached to schedule the country's first multi-party elections in more than 40 years, 2 months later on the 4th of June. The communists, from what we hear, kind of gambled that bringing people to the polls, most people would not know who or what Solidarity was, and they would just simply vote for the old communists. They're not the most popular, but they're trying to make reforms. And it would be a way of guaranteeing some form of electoral legitimacy. And oops, what ends up happening is that Solidarity wins by like 99%. It just, people go to the polls and they're like, hey, I may not know everything about Solidarity, but if I got a chance to vote these, SOBs out of power, well then, so be it. It is, by and large, a textbook example of a negotiated transition to some form of political pluralism. Right? I mean, it's just that, then there it is, right? There it is. Within this period, Hungary, the Hungarian communists, make the decision to dismantle the border fence with Austria, effectively allowing the free passage, the travel of Hungarians just across the border into Austria. Now, this isn't some mass exodus of the country, but it shows that elements of the so-called Iron Curtain are being opened up in bits and pieces by local governments. But I guess the easiest way to surmise is that, the Hungarians had kind of read the writing on the wall, and they saw what was already happening in Poland, and they realized that there was no way for them to hold on to power without becoming more autocratic. So in a way, they just decided to transition themselves from old communists into, social democrats. It's kind of like the Hungarian communists leveled up in a way and just rolled back a number of restrictions and limits to political rights and civil liberties. But then all of a sudden the Berlin Wall opens up in East Germany, November 9th. This was the CNN moment, right, where we saw, East Germans in Berlin mounting, getting up on top of this wall, which had already been covered in graffiti, and not being shot by the East German border guards, right? This is like, the Berlin Wall on the East German side was kind of like the equivalent of the DMZ on the North Korean and South Korean border. You can kind of you can go, you can look, but you can't touch. You can't go anywhere near that, especially if you're approaching it from, let's say, the North Korean side. Oh, they will fire on you, right? Actually, if you approach it from the South Korean side, the North will fire on you as well. But when we saw people not just mounting the wall, but coming with pickaxes and bulldozers and shovels and things knocking the wall down, we thought, all right, this is our symbolic moment. The wall opened almost by bureaucratic accident. There is this great video, which I will include right here, which I think it was the very night of November the 9th, some East German official had read some documents saying that the East German government was going to allow transit of citizens of East Berlin through the Brandenburg Gate, which is where the wall had kind of reached, into West Berlin. Now, initially, the idea was this was going to be somehow a coordinated, coming soon type of thing. And some journalists in the conference room had asked this guy when, and he kind of looked at the paper, kind of turned it over, and really was figuring out what to make of it, because there was no specifics. But he said, in a way, almost immediately, without any real restrictions. And this was like broadcast across everywhere, across Western Europe, Eastern Europe. People heard about this on their radios, and a whole bunch of Germans from East Berlin were like, hell, I'm in my nightgown, I'm in my pajamas, but screw this, I'm going to go and do this, because who knows if they're going to close it the next day.
Und deshalb haben wir uns dazu entschlossen, heute eine Regelung zu treffen, die es jedem Bürger der DDR möglich macht, über Grenzübergangspunkte der DDR auszureisen.
Wann tritt das in Kraft?
Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort. Unverzüglich.
And so when there's like thousands and thousands of people that are gathered there, and the border guards don't even know what to do, and they're like, well, we don't have enough bullets to shoot people, the border guards stand down because they're like, well, this is just going to cause a riot. And the minute that one or two groups of people are able to travel through the Brandenburg Gate just to go to West Berlin for the first time, that was it, right? It was done. There's just sort of this idea that, well, the East German government is not coming back after this. There's no way that they can reclaim control. And no, not a surprise. The East German government collapses very quickly, and less than a year later ceases to exist, right? The whole country merges with West Germany. About 2 weeks or so later, we have what is known as the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, which begins with a number of student protests and just the outpouring of public protest against just an increasingly inept, corrupt, dysfunctional bureaucratic government, led to very, very, very few people defending this system, because those that were in charge really had no charisma, had no personality of their own, and about 2 weeks later, the whole party just simply dissolved its control on power. A few weeks later, the communist power monopoly ends in Bulgaria on the 11th of December. Within that time period, there actually is an uprising in Romania within the western Romanian city of Timișoara. This begins around the 16th of December, and very, very, very quickly just kind of spreads to the rest of the country. Now, it's in Romania that there is some kind of pushback. In Romania, the communist leadership, under the control of Nicolae Ceausescu and his equally, if not more, hated wife Elena. This is really kind of like a Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, Kim Jong-il type of regime here. Has the capacity to order the state security apparatus to fight back. And there actually is a number of gunfights and clashes in Timișoara, in Bucharest, and in other places. But ultimately, there actually is an internal party coup among more moderate members of the Romanian communists that decide to just throw the Ceausescu's literally into a firing squad and take control of the situation. We'll talk about that when we get to the section on the Balkans. On a more problematic level is the dissolution of Yugoslavia, which, had the country not broken up into 6 constituent states and remained whole, I think Yugoslavia would have been the most likely country to get into the European Union before anybody else. It was the most developed, the most modern, the most moderate of all of these communist states, but the wars of secession kind of sidelined economic modernization for national identity and self-determination, which set most of the country back, 30 years. The problem really is, with the exception of Slovenia, which seceded and got out really quickly, and Croatia, which was just kind of given, I think, a token gesture of membership. The rest of Yugoslavia remains outside of the European Union today, right? And then finally, the Soviet Union, which hangs on for, another 2 years, but eventually the same type of problems, hit the country. Gorbachev was increasingly seen as the one responsible for the loss of the satellite states in Central and Southeastern Europe. There is a coup that happens while Gorbachev is on vacation, an old, party coup of old school hardline Stalinist apparatchiks who take control of the country in about 48 hours and are, planning on returning the Soviet Union to the good old days of the early 1930s, whatever it happens to be. And there's just no one in the streets are having it. I mean, the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are like, screw you, we're out of here. There's protests in Kiev, in Moscow, in Leningrad, elsewhere. The coup really has no major support, especially when the army refuses orders to fire into the crowd. The coup leaders quickly are rounded up and arrested, and before any kind of restoration of the Soviet Union takes place, Gorbachev just kind of never comes back to power, but a fateful decision is made by the then president of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, Boris Yeltsin, to agree with Ukraine, Belarus, and others to dissolve the entire Soviet Union. Before we know it, right? Before we know it, like, this age-old enemy of the United States is disintegrated. Right? December the 26th, 1991, I remember watching this on the evening news. The Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle, is lowered in the Kremlin for the last time. And right in its replacement is the tricolor Russian flag. And that's it. The Soviet Union is done. What we thought was going to last for another 30, 40, 50 years collapses 2 years after Poland agrees to sit down at a circular table. And so these are the events that, produce the next 30 years of transition, development, modernization, democratization, which, as I mentioned in the introduction, have given us some successful results, at least quantitatively, while others have actually gotten worse than they were either in the Soviet, communist, or Yugoslav period. So if you remember from the first lecture here, right, Central Europe is primarily free. There are some ambiguous degrees of partly free states in the former Yugoslavia that's not yet in the European Union. Hungary is this big exception, which leads us to believe, right, is Hungary the exception, or is Hungary the vanguard for what the future will bring for the rest of these countries? And then the rest of the Soviet Union just remains largely, if not entirely, authoritarian. And, once again, shout out to our boys in Mongolia for just kind of being, super cool hipster Democrats. But, again, just to quickly review here, not a surprise, the countries that are closer to the European Union remain consolidated democracies and are now EU members. And those that are still waiting to get in are kind of in this partly free halfway house, while those that are well within Central Asia, with the exception of Belarus because of the leadership of Lukashenko, remains authoritarian regimes, even worse off than they were in the Soviet period. So, with all of that, that's our, little coverage of what had happened in 1989. That leaves us with some questions to consider for the remaining part of this discussion. Number one, why have some post-communist countries transitioned to democracy faster and better than others? I kind of gave one of the answers away. You could just say, well, because of the EU. But why have some countries, even without the EU being there or, whatever, why have they remained in some kind of halfway house between democracy and authoritarianism? And, Hungary is a great example to ask this. It's in the EU. Poland is, state capture is not as great in Poland as it is in Hungary, but if Kaczynski gets his way, trust me, he's going to follow Orban's playbook. So why have some countries actually gotten even worse? We can get to, Central Asia and the Caucasus, in due time, but, again, undergoing transition from authoritarian rule doesn't necessarily make you a democracy. Right? You got to actually, consciously and actively push for it. Otherwise, you're just going to get something else. And you might be lucky if you get something else that looks democratic, but, if it's just simply a group of oligarchs and power brokers looking to seize power and consolidate control, well, hey, you get Belarus, you get Kazakhstan, you get Russia, you get Albania, for that matter. Second question to consider. Was the nature of communist government equal across the region? Spoiler alert, no, it wasn't. But the reason why I'm asking this is because for a long time, people in both the policymaking and the academic circles assumed it to be. Right? It doesn't matter whether you were Russia or Poland or Hungary or Romania or Bulgaria or whatever, communism was communism was communism. And if we know now that the nature of authoritarian communist government was not the same, but had various degrees of authoritarianism, what does that have to say about the nature of transition? Right? If some countries were a bit more moderate and willing to compromise, does that give us any indication to believe that they're more consolidated democracies today? And if some of these governments fought tooth and nail to hold on to power before they were, strung up in front of a wall and shot on Christmas Day, talking about you, Romania, does that explain the endemic and entrenched corruption and political disappointment that many people in the country have? Third question to ask. What are the key variables necessary for democratic transition, growth, and consolidation? Within your, run-of-the-mill Time Magazine, Newsweek, Economist, Wall Street Journal, New York Times op-ed, Washington Post sections, the answer is pretty simple, right? The strong guiding hands of the European Union, the World Bank, and the United States. Sort of a modern-day white man's burden to pacify and civilize these Slavs. If you're wondering, oh dear God, is this class going to go in that direction? No, it's not. Right? This class actually is going to be a bit more nuanced than the Tom Friedmans and the Nicholas Kristofs of the world. And note that there is specific criteria for institutional development, social empowerment, and cultural democratization. In this case, it's going to involve a lot more research and a lot more in-depth investment in a country than simply saying, put your crappy industries up on the global market for auction, build as many McDonald's as possible, and just become capitalist. If you follow that model, you get Viktor Orban. You get Vladimir Putin. You get Yaroslav Kaczynski. You get a whole bunch of political strongmen. If you really want to transition a country from bureaucratic authoritarian to alpine democratic, you're going to have to do a lot more than that. And that's where this class is hopefully going to open up some ideas. But before we do that, right, it's worth noting that Western perceptions of Eastern Europe during the Cold War certainly marred many of our approaches and understandings of the region, right? So, it's not enough to just simply figure out what was the nature of the communist governments in each of these countries, but what did we in the West think, right? What did the White House think? What did the State Department and the CIA think? Because, look, academics can tell you that, this brand of communism was slightly more moderate than that one, but nobody reads our stuff, unfortunately. It's some of these drive-by policymakers from the State Department or the CIA that, can't tell a Slovenia from a Slovakia, just like, well, it's Eastern Europe and here's what needs to be done. And by and large, some of the perceptions were basically influenced by what a lot of diaspora communities were paying them to think. So, for instance, when it came to most of Central Europe, it was just assumed that the communist bloc was monolith, controlled by the Soviet Union. So whether it was Poland or Hungary or Czechoslovakia, it didn't matter what the local decision-making was within its leadership because they were all puppets of Moscow. And they were seen as occupied, right? That was the big thing, is that, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, because of a large group of emigre communities in the United States, in the UK, in France, and elsewhere, right? And a lot of these communities, I have to say, weren't necessarily genuine in their assessment of what was going on, but they had an agenda to push, especially if a lot of them ended up showing up shortly after 1945. And you don't really want to ask why, but, whatever. But the point is that the understanding was these three countries were the good guy countries that were occupied by the evil Russians. Right, so forget the fact that these countries had homegrown communist movements of their own, that they were all governed by their own authoritarian apparatus, and most importantly, these three countries, particularly Czechoslovakia and Poland, were the most resistant to efforts at reforming both political and economic structure once Gorbachev comes to power. So it's not just these evil, pesky Russians that are making life miserable. No, it's actually their own goddamn leadership that was doing so. But this was not seen in late 89, 90, 91. It was sort of understood that Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, right? These were the sacrificial lambs that we had abandoned after World War II. And so there was this outpouring of sympathy and empathy for bringing them into the community of European nations first before anyone else. Because look, Budapest, Prague, these are beautiful Habsburg cities that just so happen to be on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. So our assessment of these countries was overwhelmingly optimistic and almost to the point of overtly generous, right? So whatever they needed, whatever they wanted, these guys are going to become westernized first before anybody else. This is a big difference between what was perceived in the Balkans. Here we're talking about Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Albania. Less of an emigre community, less of some kind of international lobby, and for the most part, we just didn't really know much about them. Maybe Yugoslavia because of their orientation towards the West, and, it became a cheap vacation spot in the 1980s. But Romania, Bulgaria, less said about Albania, the better. Nobody knew anything about them, right? And what was also known is that Romania and Albania were not necessarily Soviet satellites. They did run their own show, no different from that of the other three, but that was kind of known. Like, there was no victimhood, there was no occupation. And in this case, the quality of life was much less, the geography was much more remote. Same thing goes with Bulgaria. So we're talking about countries that are, at the absolute best, second tier, the next batch of countries for us to worry about. So we're going to focus really on those poor countries of Central Europe. And the Balkans, considering that, especially in Yugoslavia, they're all killing and fighting each other over some quote-unquote mythological ancient hatreds as early as 91, 92, I ain't touching that hornet's nest, right? Let's focus on Central Europe, and we'll worry about the rest of these guys, at, some later point. But, the thing to understand here is that once 1990 happens, right? 1989 gives us this major moment of optimism. I gotta tell you, I still can think about it now and say we were all really happy, including people in Eastern Europe, that something was, changing. And I think the apex of human happiness, at least in recent memory, was New Year's Eve, 1989 to 1990, where David Hasselhoff is singing "I've Been Looking for Freedom" at the Brandenburg Gate New Year's night, right? This was the apex of his career, and I actually have to say pretty much the apex of human optimism, right? It was just, we had one great moment of David Hasselhoff just singing for a united Germany. It was all great, or soon to be united Germany, right? We all had our New Year's, party. We listened to the Vienna Philharmonic, and, we sober up the next Monday, Tuesday, workday morning, and we realized, all right, we got some work to do. It's kind of been sort of downhill from there. But the understanding, right? The understanding here is that Eastern Europe is free. They are free of communism. Not authoritarianism, but they're free of communism. They're free of Bolshevism, Marxism, socialism. And it's all the same as far as American political pundits are concerned. We can even say even today, right? For those of you that are following what's happening in American political culture, that the further right-wing you are, you hear the word socialism and, you might as well just be one step away from the gulags. Whereas people that kind of want socialism are yeah, could I have dental? Could I have like, I don't know, 37 as opposed to 40 hours of work? Could I have like, I don't know, environmental protections? But for somebody who views socialism as bad, it might as well be communism or Stalinism or whatever it is, right? So, the problem is that our perception of Eastern Europe coming out of the communist bloc after 45 years is that they are coming out of an omnipresent world that was anti-democratic, anti-capitalist, anti-liberty, and anti-religious. Right? The stereotypes and the stigmas of Marxism, communism, socialism in the United States alone, right, already developed into something, sophisticated within the McCarthy era. And a lot of this certainly was perpetuated by the tone that was taken first by Reagan and then by Bush the Elder. And look, let's be honest, when the Berlin Wall opens and East Germans and West Germans, right, on both sides of Berlin, are allowed to travel, right? You think about this, right? It's like a door that was locked is open, and there are people on both sides of this door. Who goes where? Right? The majority of Germans went from East Berlin to the West. How many people from West Berlin decided to take this opportunity and say, hey, let's look what life is like in the East? Like, I don't know, maybe one or two, like, tragically hipster communists or whatever it was, right? But most of the part, everybody from the East went West, right? And what did they want? This was the best part about it. What did they want? They wanted stuff. They wanted bananas. They wanted music. They wanted McDonald's. They didn't give a hoot about democracy. You know what they wanted? They wanted stuff. They wanted material goods. They wanted stuff that was denied them from the previous 45 years. This is not lost on the CBSs, the NBCs, the New York Times, right? It shows that, this was a victory for market capitalism, right? Adam Smith beats Karl Marx. That's it. And it has never, that argument has never been reviewed ever again. It is seen as a referendum on the systemic, ideological, teleological understanding of all things Marxist and communist. Is that a correct assessment of what really happened in 1989? I don't think so, right? We're not really asking people back then what they wanted. My guess is that what they ultimately wanted was just simply an end to a bunch of horrible bureaucratic authoritarian governments. Governments which really didn't care much about communism or socialism or whatever it was by that period. But, to emphasize the point here, you want to talk about the way in which communism was perceived. This is the cover of a book that my mother had when she was either in the later stages of middle school or the early grades of high schools. And we're talking here like late 50s, early 60s. I still have this book. I love this book, right? What you should know about I swear to God, this is something that like Prager would send out, all right? I might get like some of these, brochures sent from like Hillsdale College or the Atlas Society or whatever it was, right? And they might even just like carbon copy some. In fact, some of you might even be listening maybe to this lecture. Feel free to screen capture this image right now and send it on your next brochure, and we'll see what ends up happening. But you can kind of get a sense of what we know about communism, right? It's a picture of the Soviet Union. It's black and white. I got to tell you, even when I was a kid, again, Generation X, I was convinced as a young kid that life in the communist world was so bad they had even gotten rid of color. Right? It's because all the photos were black and white. And you've got, tanks and missiles, and it looks rather ominous. Nothing, prosperous. Forget the fact that the commies, put the first satellite in space, put the first man in space, and in many cases served as an ideology that, kind of galvanized the United States to, basically codify the Civil Rights Act, because God forbid we should, have even less freedoms than the Reds do. But the way in which communism was presented to most Americans is this idea that if you live in a communist society, your life is a lot crappier than a capitalist one. You have to work longer hours to get the basic necessities of life. So even here, this is taken from a page in that book. The time a person must work to be able to buy goods. So in the United States, the average American needs to work no more than 3 minutes to make enough money to buy a bar of soap, right? In Soviet Union, 32 minutes. Same thing, 3 minutes to make enough money to buy sugar, an hour and 4 in the Soviet Union. 56 for a shirt, 15 hours, basically 2 whole days for someone in the Soviet Union to make enough money to buy a shirt. 4 hours and 36 minutes for a dress, basically almost 2 weeks in the Soviet Union. It goes from stockings to a full suit. I mean, take a look there. Potatoes, all right, 2 minutes and 7 minutes. All right, again, everybody needs their vodka. 7 hours, 61 hours for shoes, 17 minutes, 2 hours for eggs, tea, 6 and 33, milk, 8 and 31, okay, bread, 6 and 9. So, what we basically walk away from here is that, the average Russian has enough money for potatoes and bread. Good job. Grab a beet and, you're off to the races here, comrade. But, look, even more recently, I remember this one. This was a picture taken in the New York Times sometime around late 89, 90. It's a picture of, people in Romania, but the picture was black and white. I don't know if they hired these people, but this has to be the most Eastern European photo that I have ever seen. Now, I have been to Romania. Now, mind you, I've been to Romania a lot later than 1989, 1990. But, it's kind of funny that, even today, you'll, go on to mainstream media and, they will always try to find some photos of some non-Western country, whether it's in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or someplace else, of people that just look depressed and miserable and downtrodden. I mean, for God's sake, you look at this picture and you think to yourself, my God, no wonder these people have been suffering under Marxism for years. But again, the stereotypes, the images that were played up in the West is these poor peasants who know nothing of anything besides bread, right? Indoor plumbing might still be a new thing for them. I mean, the stereotypes were ridiculous. And this was not just Romania, Bulgaria, and whatever. I mean, this included Poland and Hungary and Yugoslavia. So, I think that one of the reasons why understanding 1989, in the right way is important for us to get a sense of why politics are the way that they are. Because perhaps the reason why things are not as rosy as we would like to think is because many in the West didn't get 1989 right? Didn't understand what needed to be done in order to provide a smooth transition. And so one of the readings that I assigned for my students, and this is, the 3 Approaches to Communist Studies by Grzegorz Ikert. He notes that, early assessments of Eastern Europe after 1989 focused on this so-called communist legacy liability paradigm, which by and large was overtly pessimistic, almost nihilistic for the future of all of these emerging states and societies because of decades of single-party communist rule and planned economic systems, right? So in other words, how are we going to build democracy in countries and regions that have been dominated by Leninism? And in this case, Leninism is understood to be this almost Orwellian totalitarian ideology, right? Those of us who, read 1984 back in the day, and, I remember I did this in the early 90s, it was pushed on us that, Orwell was kind of likening Big Brother to that of the Soviet Union, to that of Joseph Stalin, despite the fact that Orwell was a lefty for his entire life. But hey, New Jersey Board of Education has something different to say. But hey, guess what? Be that as it may, Leninism was, considered to be an all-pervasive totalitarian ideology that eliminated, or at the absolute best, significantly crippled the potential for political pluralism, civil liberties, and personal freedoms. And, if there's not really one book that cornered the market on this thinking, but one of the earliest ones that was written, I think it was 91, 92, by Ken Jowett, his book, The New World Disorder, The Leninist Extinction, makes the argument that there is very little fertile ground for these countries, and even more so these societies, to build democratic governance on their own. And so it really requires the help, the constant help of the West to teach the Slav how to engage in political pluralism, right? Again, a type of white man's burden. that comes along with that. Now, fortunately, this phase was very short-lived, and by 93, 94, we began to see results where transitioning countries didn't recede back into authoritarianism or civil war. I mean, the Balkans are one thing, but Central Europe, a different story. And this gave us, particularly within the academic circle, some guarded optimism that, oh crap, this thing could actually work. And here is when really the democratic transition paradigm enters into the discussion. And this is when the academic field really begins to take off. Right now, there had been, works already in democratic transition theory focusing on Latin America, Southern Europe, a little bit of Eastern Asia. But once it's known that Eastern Europe is actually capable of doing things on its own, the field just explodes. Just completely and utterly opens up. Most notably with, I have to say, one of the better works in that period, Juan Lin's and Alfred Stepan's great classic, Problems of Democratic Transition and Consolidation. It's a phenomenal comparative analytical book. I'm just looking at my bookshelf right now and I'm pointing to it. I assign chapters in my Intro to Comparative Politics class. It's a great book. It's not the be-all, end-all, but what it does do is it acknowledges substantial differences in authoritarian communist states among countries. And not only that, makes the argument, and this is a big one, that the nature of the authoritarian government, and alongside that, the nature of authoritarian withdrawal, largely determines the possible transition paths that are available to each state upon regime collapse. In other words, a country that is authoritarian but willing to compromise itself into a negotiated transition is more likely to give us some kind of nascent consolidated democracy. On the other end of the spectrum, a regime that fights tooth and nail to stay in power is either A, going to survive like China did, or B, collapse like Romania did. But because there's no old regime to work with, the new incoming government tends to be much more top-down, equally autocratic, and detached from public scrutiny. Models were made with other countries that had done this in Southern Europe, particularly Spain. Spain was a really good example of a country that, after the death of Francisco Franco in 1975, underwent a couple of years of negotiated transition from basically all political and cultural circles, except the Basques, who did not come to the negotiated settlements. But everyone else, including the Catalans, the communists, the socialists, the old phalangists, the Catholic Church, everybody kind of agrees to disagree on a number of things and agree to move the country forward. This is kind of the nature of this phase here, is that you acknowledge what you're not going to be able to solve right now, you find the stuff that you can find common ground on, and you build that up. You wait a few years, maybe even a generation, then you start transitioning a little bit more on the stuff that you couldn't agree on back then, because it's less likely the country will fragment now that we're a consolidated democracy. And this was great. This was great for most of the 90s, even the early 2000s. But, by the time the '08 economic recession hits, we kind of see a number of anomalies, little snafus, little surprises here. As reformist movements stall, and in some cases even reverse, right? Reformist movements in Hungary give way to Viktor Orban. The civic nationalism of Solidarity gives way to more parochial social conservatism of Jaroslaw Kaczynski's Law and Justice Party. Attempts at trying to be more cosmopolitan in many of the former Yugoslav countries gives way to ethnic political power brokerage. What we see are really the limits of structural liberalism, especially when economic downturn occurs. A big thing to note here is that a lot of this stuff happens either around or shortly following the 2008 economic crisis, which hit almost every single country. And since then, we have noted that neoliberal structural reforms can only take us so far. And when a lot of segments of the population are not benefiting from this type of modernization, not a surprise, they will gravitate, if a party exists, to some form of national populism. But be that as it may, the thing to take away from this second phase, and one that I think still holds a lot of salience, is the argument made by Linz and Stepan, and I'm taking this directly from their chapter 3, page 55. The characteristics of the previous non-democratic regime have profound implications for the transition paths available and the tasks different countries face when they begin their struggles to develop consolidated democracies. We're gonna go with this. I'm gonna use this model when I discuss the nature of authoritarian withdrawal and transition. It still carries a lot of saliency. The reformist elements a few years later might be problematic, but the initial period of transition, I think they were right on the money for that. And to give you an example, right, the nature of authoritarianism in Eastern Europe in 1989 varies across the board. This is something that is now universally accepted, right? The whole monolithic element of communism is thrown out the window unless you're, listening to conservative talk radio. Within the, so-called success stories of Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, we have a type of post-totalitarian, bureaucratic authoritarian model. Power is omnipresent. Oppression is pervasive, but it's not tyrannical. It's not Big Brother. It's not North Korea. It's not Stalin. It's kind of like a dictatorship run by the DMV, It's dictatorship run by a bunch of unassuming, uncharismatic, non-thinking outside-the-box bureaucrats who really want stability more than anything else. And so when pressure mounts on their leadership to improve situations, they're more often than not likely to provide some kind of compromise. And if this happens, there is a lot more of a chance for these countries to develop stably and with a lot more involvement. Not much can be said about this when we look at the next model, a type of national Marxist government. Both of these are really characterized in Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, which means that communism was not necessarily tied to some kind of external control by the Soviet Union, but really had more historical and symbolic ties with some kind of homegrown wartime struggle in the 1940s. And this is especially true of Yugoslavia, right? So, there is a certain degree of legitimacy in many parts of Eastern Europe where people who were not happy with the system could basically say, down with communism, down with the Soviets, right? These bastards gave us these paper-pushing, no-frills governments. And to a degree that they were right. Yugoslavia is a different story, right? The Yugoslav communist officials have some legitimate street credibility for creating their own government, which is why it was much more difficult to cast off than it was in many of these other countries. And this is especially true for Serbia, parts of Bosnia, Croatia, Macedonia, and Montenegro. But national Marxism provides a certain degree of legitimacy for the old regime, and they are not as easily pushed over as their bureaucratic counterparts. Worse still were legitimate police states like East Germany and Romania. So, we're talking here about, I wouldn't even call them communist. I would say definitely almost fascist in that regard, right? The omnipresent state security apparatus was still alive and well in both of these countries. Now, all these countries had their own state security apparatus, right? KGB, UDBA, Securitate, Stasi, whatever. But the state security apparatus in, the bureaucratic and the national Marxist ones had just kind of receded into the background. The Stasi for East Germany and the Securitate for Romania were still as alive and active in the late 80s as they were in the late 50s. And so in this case, when these regimes collapsed, there was very little room for negotiation. The people did not want to offer anybody any kind of quarter. It was, for the most part, you saw with Romania, the Ceausescus were basically given the firing squad. And then probably the most weirdest out of all of them was Albania, which was really under some kind of patrimonial sultanistic system under Enver Hoxha. Very few people actually know about what was going on in Albania during the communist period. It was kind of like the North Korea of Eastern Europe. Hoxha had this cult following within a country that was, for the most part, hermetically sealed. Like, nobody could go in, nobody could go out. But when the country did transition in the early 90s, there was very little leverage for public participation to push for any kind of democratic pluralism. Instead, Hoxha dies in 1985 and leaves a bunch of inept successors that see the writing on the wall in other places in Eastern Europe and just kind of try to reform on their own, but they still have access to privilege and power and authority that are guardedly protected against the larger masses. So, the presence of active civil society in Poland is something that is almost completely gone in a place like Albania or Romania or, East Germany. So, we have to note here, the conditional strength also of democratic opposition. How powerful were they in taking over the state, in coercing the old regime to negotiate some kind of transition? We got a little spoiled when we looked at Poland, right? In Poland, the opposition was organized, it was unified, it was much more active and empowered with a set of defined goals, right? Solidarity begins as a movement in the late 70s. It is pushed underground in 1981 after the military crackdown, but it's never dissolved. It just kind of exists as like this underground ideological resistance movement, which by the late 80s, 87, 88, 89, reemerges to hold accountable the problems of the Polish state to such a degree that the Polish communist authorities, they look to Moscow. Gorbachev is like, what do you want from me? Work with them. It's your country. They have to cut a deal with Solidarity. Solidarity is way too legitimate and way too powerful. Not so in other countries. There might have been opposition in East Germany and the Czech Republic, but they were a bit more spontaneous. They might have had some kind of leadership. The Czech Republic specifically, always will turn to the writings of the playwright Václav Havel. But Havel was really an academic, whereas Solidarity was led by Lech Walesa, who was a trade union leader, right? He was much more of a teamster than an academic. So there's only so much that, opposition in the Czech Republic or East Germany can do. There is a greater balance of opposition and old regime legitimacy and leverage in places like Hungary and Slovenia and Bulgaria. It testifies also to the effectiveness of negotiated transitions. But in this sense, there is a greater likelihood of the old regime to not only survive the transition, but to be part of the new transitioning coalition government. So it's not uncommon that we might see former communists, take on the mantle of reformism or, kind of evolve into some kind of like liberal Democrat or whatever it is. But within these countries today, there is grumblings that, some of the political elites used to be the old communists that ran the country about, 30 or so years ago. And in less fortunate places, we find the existence of opposition, certainly, but there's no unity. There's really is no leadership. There's a bunch of different goals and movements, sometimes competing with each other before they compete with the old regime. And so that's why, elements of the old regime were, if not able to hold on to power, although in Serbia that was certainly the case. The communists just kind of transformed themselves into national defenders of the Serbian people. But, the incoming governments in Romania, Slovakia, and Croatia are all, to a degree, associated in some degree with the old Communist Party. They might have been reformed communists, but they're still elitist. They're still oligarchic. And they have little to no tolerance for civic activism or public input. So, this should kind of give you a sense of what capabilities do the democratic oppositions have at the moment of transition, because if we know that would give us a sense of why some countries are able to develop better than others. So it's not just because Poland is closer to the EU or has a better history in the medieval period than, let's say, Serbia does. Actually, if you want to really, look at it in a neat way, aside from Poland, Serbia, specifically Serbia, witnessed the largest amount of public opposition and civic activism against entrenched governments for any other country except for Poland. And this was late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, just throughout the entire thing. But why was it that Serbia was unable to transition from public protest into consolidated government? Right? One could say the capabilities of the entrenched regime, the disparity and the disorganization of the opposition, and the idea that there really wasn't a lot of international support for that as well. Once again, I keep saying this, we'll get to that when we get to these specific lectures. So, there's a few things that we need to take into account as we begin to wrap up this discussion here. And, this really is just the all-encompassing way of assessing what we need to know 30 years after 1989. And I am comfortable enough in making the following arguments. Number one, and this I hold true more and more every year. Communism was not, nor was it ever, a monolithic phenomenon. So to assume that 1989 was a defeat of communism as an ideology is a constructed narrative that has a specific agenda to push in neoliberal American circles. In reality, each state practiced and implemented an interpretation of communism, but from a single-party perspective. Single-party bureaucratic authoritarian government is not, I think, what Marx had in mind. So to suggest that 89 was really a defeat for communism misses the larger argument that it was a defeat for entrenched, rigid, uncompromising, bureaucratic authoritarian governments run by increasingly old, cantankerous, and unimaginable men. Number two, another thing to take away. By the 1980s, the reason why I said it wasn't about communism is because by the 1980s, communism was controlled but not regulated by the Soviet Union, especially by the 1980s. Communism, Marxism, socialism stopped being any kind of believable ideology that got people up in the morning by the late 60s, early 70s. The people that ran these governments were communists simply because that was their identification card. I mean, that was basically it. In fact, a way to push this argument even further is that many of the countries that are Soviet satellites had at least one major social uprising against the Soviet Union in its time. East Germany had one in 53, Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, and Poland in 81. Or at least in Poland, there was a threat of one. In each of these revolutions, at least certainly for the first three, these revolutions began as really anti-Soviet, not anti-communist. Right? The idea was to almost liberate the country from a type of quasi-colonial control that Moscow had held over them. And rather than allow them to kind of go their own autonomous ways, this is where we get the whole concept of tankies, right? Soviet tanks come in, or Eastern Bloc tanks come in and crush the movement. Probably the most tragic one was Czechoslovakia of 1968, because the movement, I think, had genuine goals to reform communism, or in the words of Alexander Dubček, the head of state at the time, socialism with a human face, And Dubček probably would have had a lot in common with someone like, Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, right? Not the Joseph Stalins or the Mao Zedongs or any of those kind of people, right? Poland, it was, this is what actually led Solidarity to be pushed underground, because it was feared that the same thing would happen. And the Polish military basically got a little telegram from Moscow saying, you deal with that shit or we'll deal with it. Hence the military crackdown that led to Poland basically becoming more or less a military bureaucratic dictatorship. The point to be made here is that after all four of these revolutions had failed, the Kremlin appoints a bunch of uncharismatic, bureaucratic yes men, paper pushers, right, whose goal was more to placate Moscow than to do anything productive and progressive for their countries. So again, if you want to talk about the nature of transition, you also need to talk about the characteristics of the head of state of the country under that transition. Poland's Wojciech Jaruzelski was less a politician and more of a military head. Hence, he was much more likely to cooperate for the sake of stability rather than risking a full-blown revolution. János Kadar, probably of the group that I will show you right now, the most reformist-minded. You take a look at the tenure of time that these people were in power. I mean, obviously, Jaruzelski comes in 81 from the crackdown to 92. You can pretty much put two and two together there. Kadar, 56 from the Hungarian Revolution to 88 when he basically dies. Right? So these guys are in power up until they're found dead. And at a certain point, they're not interested in being dynamic. They want stability, right? They want quiet. If there ever was somebody who was the consummate example of a paper pusher, and, kind of like the Leonid Brezhnev of Central Europe, it's Gustav Husak. Again, take a look at the years. 1969, right after Prague Spring, to his ouster in power 20 years later in 1989. Todor Zhivkov, and I'm sure if none of you have ever heard of these people beforehand, there's a reason, right? There's a reason, especially, Zhivkov. I mean, these are, of all the, they're all there to just keep things under wraps. They're there to keep Moscow happy. They're there to just keep stability. If it means, releasing some pressure here or there, so be it. But if it also means stamping out pluralism, that's also going to happen as well. But, not with gulags and torture, but, house arrest and fines and, your apartment's definitely going to be bugged. There's no question about that. Now, when we get to the second group of people, these are the more hated, right? Jaruzelski, Kadar, Husak, and Zhivkov. I mean, they could be given, early retirement for the most part. When it comes to East Germany, these guys were basically as hated as their Nazi predecessors. So the longtime party secretary of East Germany, Erich Honecker, widely understood to be the head of a horribly run police state. In fact, his lieutenant, his right-hand man, and this is someone that actually has somehow survived history just by obscurity, but Erich Mielke ran the Stasi until his ouster in 1989. Those who knew him and those who have written about him have actually said that Mielke's Stasi was in many cases even worse than the Gestapo. Like, just think about that for a moment. Like, Erich Mielke was to East Germany what Heinrich Himmler was to the Nazi regime. So there is really no chance in negotiating with these guys. Honecker was actually, I think he fled the country. He was fled to South America. I think Mielke definitely did time in prison. And, there's no one mourning either of them. And then you got to wonder, okay, who can get any worse than that? Well, I told you, the gruesome twosome, the mom and pop, phenomenon that ran Romania from the 60s to bang bang, Christmas morning, 1989, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu. These two are more likely to be compared with Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-il, Bashar al-Assad. Their type of authoritarianism was not bureaucratic, but, a combination of sultanism and a police state. If there was anyone in Romania that was hated more than Nicolae, it was his wife Elena, who was widely regarded as having little more than a third grade level of education, although the state media tried to prop her up as this world-renowned physicist and chemist who had like multiple PhDs. And after 89, the Securitate files were open and we got to see her grade school report card. I think she dropped out after the 6th or 7th grade. Apparently she did kind of good in needlepoint, but that was about it, So we're not exactly talking about people that are really going to be around to either, defend the cause like the people at the top or negotiate their way into something consensual. No. I mean, many of these people either just wanted retirement or were given jail time or the wall. There is two exceptions to this rule. They're both historical, but I need to bring them out. I mentioned Dubček already. Gotta tell you, I like Dubček. He was a good guy. I think he was in over his head. I think he was either before or after his time. I think his ideas for socialism with a human face in a parallel universe would have developed Czechoslovakia at the absolute least to the level of Yugoslavia. And under Tito, whom I got to tell you, when Tito died and there were people that were crying, this was not out of fear. There were people that were genuinely upset that Tito had died, right? I know people whose parents back in the day, they were genuinely upset. I mean, the guy was legitimately loved. He was a decent guy. I'm not saying that he was, a benevolent, leader that, could do no wrong. But in comparison to these other blokes, Dubček and Tito, not bad people. Dubček, unfortunately, had little time to do anything in Czechoslovakia. Like I said, in a parallel universe, we might have seen some development where it would have reached the level of Yugoslavia and then probably just kind of kept evolving into that of, Austria or even Germany for that matter. And also in a parallel universe, Yugoslavia did not break up. Tito actually had a successor. That was one of the big things that he didn't. So when he dies, people are like, well, who's gonna fill this dude's shoes? In a parallel universe, he did. The country did not break up, and Yugoslavia got into the European Union probably as early as 1995. It really had a lot of potential, and it's one of the big tragedies that it broke up the way that it did into a number of smaller, squabbling states and territories that it did. Okay, so moving into the conclusion of this discussion, it's worth making sense of what we've covered so far in understanding the social revolutions of 1989 and trying to separate it from its more wider accepted narrative that all of these protests, all of these revolutions were referendums on communism and the complete and utter failure of Marxism. If we want to talk about when communism as a working ideology truly failed, I would say less 1989 and more Prague Spring 1968. We'd already seen similar incidents like this in East Germany 1953 and Hungary 1956, in which reformist socialist movements were deemed a threat to the larger regional hegemony, and just like Czechoslovakia, attempts at reforming socialism, making it a bit more user-friendly. I mean, in many cases, making it what its original, theorists had intended it to be, were stamped out and replaced with pro-Kremlin leadership. Most of this leadership was unassuming, uncharismatic, and just simply more put there as yes men for the Soviet Union. And so, in this case, communism as a workable, optimistic, forward-thinking, zeal really ceased to hold any meaningful power, not because the public had lost interest in it, but the very promoters of communism had opted for, stability and predictability over any kind of, political theoretical dynamism. And, to offset any future social dissension, and here's where things get a bit interesting, these regimes, which were, populated, dominated by a bunch of bureaucratic paper pushers, were flexible and progressive enough to promote some improvements in the standards of living. So it's not like these governments that were imposed by the Soviet Union were there just simply to, quash out any future dissension. But within the larger context of democratic transitions literature, there is this noted paradox of what we call authoritarian performance legitimacy, right? And this is an interesting observation here because authoritarian states don't last as long as they do by fear, tyranny, and intimidation, right? That might be tempting to think, in the West. The more omnipresent a big brother is, the more likely Oceania will survive. In the real world, that type of coercion, right, that type of top-down oppression costs a lot and usually, gets replaced as soon as the proverbial big brother dies. more often than not, the longevity of authoritarian states can be explained by a series of pragmatic solutions to, let's say, when there is public dissension or when there is the fear that the public is, that dissatisfaction is going to somehow be a little bit more prominent this year. I don't know, economic downturn, the cost of living goes up, people are getting a little bit more restless. A lot of times these governments will just simply throw in a number of reforms as a way of, nipping the proverbial revolution in the bud. So a lot of these governments were somewhat receptive to public interests, and as a way of maintaining their monopoly on power, gradually, and this is certainly with Poland and Hungary, gradually offered some degrees of economic liberalization. Even as far as Hungary was concerned, by 84, 85, the country was already looking to dabble in some rudimentary proto-market capitalism. Right? If it meant the public would be happy and stayed off the streets, well, then this is what happens. But at some point, argues performance legitimacy, authoritarian states are going to reform one step too far, and perhaps in the name of stability actually ends up undermining its own, political control, to which the public will at some point say, well, at this point, why reform so much and maintain a monopoly on power? Why don't we just simply reform politics as well and just kind of evolve into some type of representative democracy? A third thing to make sense of is, not so much what led up to 1989, but what we saw on the cameras. And that is the anti-establishment role of civil society. It's one thing to assume that those, in the public square calling for the end of the regime were somehow anti-communist. In reality, much of the public protests was more anti-authoritarian. And again, this is not a way of somehow excusing communism per se, so much as communism, as I've already mentioned, was really nowhere to be seen, except maybe in party logos and, a few mottos and anthems. But what the people were truly protesting was the entrenched authoritarian apparatus. Right? That authoritarian system may have made, some empty gestures towards communism, Marxism, socialism. But as I said, any real ideological zeal died out in the 1960s, right? So, that kind of explains the strength of protest politics, really, against a decaying government and inept leadership. It's not ideology, per se. The only ideology is that the public just wants good and accountable government. So, 1989. Less anti-communist, less referendum on Leninism, Marxism, socialism, as it is, just finally public impatience, just boiling over against bureaucratic, entrenched, inept, charismatic, non-dynamic political leadership. And so, if we take that into account, we've got a couple of hypotheses to think about. And this gives us a little bit more flexibility in understanding, 89, but, the subsequent years afterwards. The first hypothesis I have to offer is the degree and type of repression has an effect on the nature of resistance to authoritarianism, right? So the more hated the government, the more entrenched and the more repressive, the more likely challenges against the government will not invite them to any negotiated transition. Sit-down talks took place in Poland, Hungary, and to a lesser extent, Czechoslovakia. Much more open protests with, all or nothing in East Germany, Romania, and, parts of Yugoslavia. But it's not a surprise that violent uprisings take place more in sultanistic states, police states, than they do in bureaucratic regimes, for one very important reason. Bureaucratic authoritarian leadership isn't interested in fighting. They've been placating and compromising and wiggling out of, any precarious situation for 20, 30 years. For them, performance legitimacy is the way to go. Offer some concessions and, hope that half the people go home. But in governments where tyranny, top-down state control is much more prominent, right? And this is, certainly in Romania, the uprisings, which might start peaceful, are going to be met with a crackdown. That crackdown is then going to ignite the population, as it did first in Timișoara and then openly in Bucharest and elsewhere. So the degree and the type of repression has an effect on the nature of resistance to authoritarianism. That gives us a lot of creativity to consider. Number two, relations with the Soviet Union determine the independence of the security apparatus. I didn't talk too much about this in this lecture, but not a surprise that the resistance to public protests against entrenched leadership happens in really the two states that are not under the control of the Soviet Union or have any Red Army troops stationed there. That is Romania and Yugoslavia. In Romania, while the war, if you want to call it that, was much shorter and far less destructive than what took place in Yugoslavia, there were attempts, as I already mentioned, by less so the National Army of Romania, but Ceausescu's secret police, the Securitate, in maintaining some kind of control or leverage, over politics, which is the reason why more than 1,000 people, if not more, were killed in the clashes between December the 19th and December 25th, 26th. Yugoslavia, on the other hand, unfortunately, as we all know, had its own army, it had its own security apparatus, and thus was able to not only fight back against challenges to the regime, but also fought back in some nominal way against what eventually became wars of secession. But it's not to say that Hungary or Poland or East Germany didn't have an army. But they basically took their marching orders from the Kremlin. And when the Soviet Union, particularly Gorbachev, effectively said that the Red Army is no longer going to intervene in the internal affairs of Central Europe, well, that was another major security pillar that was taken away. So once it became known that these corrupt, inept leaders did not have the Soviet Union anymore to prop them up like they did in 56 and 68, best thing you can do when you realize the game is up is negotiate your way into retirement, and hopefully that won't involve either a jail sentence or, fire at will. A third hypothesis, something I'm going to focus on in the next two subsequent weeks. The ethnic composition shapes inclusiveness or exclusivity. In other words, multi-ethnic states, and we find this in Romania, Yugoslavia, to a lesser extent Bulgaria, these three countries are at a greater risk in having competing narratives of identity and political values among a present minority community, whether it's the Hungarians in Romania, the Turks in Bulgaria, or pick a minority for whatever Yugoslav republic or province you want. And this is much more likely to result in fragmented solidarity when opposing the regime. We don't see this in more ethnically homogeneous states like Poland or Hungary, or even in Czechoslovakia when the two countries, when the country broke up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. They're largely homogeneous. Are there minorities there? Sure, but not enough to, make any statistical problems. So composition also has a significant effect on whether or not democracy is going to be universally accepted or internally contentious. And that leads us, therefore, to a couple of conclusions. And, this is a great way to end the first introductory week. I really hope that this stuff has opened up your eyes to understanding, at least Central and Southeastern Europe. And this should serve as a springboard to our specific case studies in the next 4 weeks. The first conclusion to reach is that a large element of anti-communist protest in 1989 was, as I've been arguing, based on counter-narratives of national identity. So, in other words, within the public protests against entrenched communist regimes, there were large elements of people pushing for nationalism and ethnocentrism, largely as a way of countering the so-called internationalist concepts of Soviet-styled communism, right? And this was among some circles, but these nationalists weren't necessarily interested in the type of liberal democracy that many in the West were supposing. They might have called themselves anti-communist. They might have referred to themselves as anti-Marxist. But we need to understand, being either anti-communist or anti-Marxist does not automatically make you pro-democratic. So in this understanding, even if the protests were targeted against a communist ideology, they were more organized around anti-communism than pro-democracy. Number two, those democratic leaders and movements that existed might have been pro-Western, right? And this is especially true in Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, certainly with Václav Havel. But a large part of that society, a large part of the ordinary citizens that were taking to the demonstrations and calling for change, they might have been drawn to the West through consumerism and pop culture. Certainly not theories of liberal democracy or free market capitalism. But it is true that, in many cases, what the public wanted was just simply more reforms. They wanted greater economic rights, which by that point also included, finally, the passing of civil liberties. This may explain why the Hungarian communists were able to hold on to power. They just simply transformed themselves into social democrats, right? It's that one country that realized, okay, the next evolutionary step is political pluralism, so hell, let's just do it. It keeps us, to some degree, in power. So again, being anti-communist, meant throwing out any and all policies and theories, unfortunately, of the political left. This was a side residual effect of this, right? So if communism was being rejected, it was really the type of anti-consumer, anti-capitalist, anti-free market enterprise. So, whereas communism, as these old decrepit parties were fading into obscurity, one might ask themselves, well, how come there were no social democratic movements or progressive left-wing movements, right? You would think, for a country that was as Marxist as it was, wouldn't there be people like, the Polish or the Hungarian version of a Bernie Sanders or a Jeremy Corbyn? Wouldn't they take the reins? And no, these things just didn't happen at all. One reason is that anything remotely left-wing was just simply stigmatized as old guard communist, Marxist. And even though these parties were, oligarchic at that point, anything regarding Marxism just simply had very little soil, little, ground to grow on. And finally, one final piece of, information to take here is that transitions from authoritarian rule, almost, to a municipality, were quickly enveloped within alternative models of international structure and control. So this might also explain the success of countries like Central Europe, because as I've already mentioned, right, the European Union and NATO were really eyeing these countries, up and down as soon as they had made that transition. And, the European Union already had this type of discussion as early as the mid-'80s, and that was, in the event that communism collapses and these countries kind of, become politically free, but, institutionally adrift, should the European community step in and provide some kind of IKEA roadmap, for democratization? But if you kind of note this, right, a lot of these countries are, working to break away from some kind of external control, only to be, wrapped up in a new forms of, external control. So we've got the Soviet Union providing some kind of guidance. Nope, screw that. We're going to go to the European Union instead. Warsaw Pact to NATO. I mean, at some points, somebody in NATO had looked at these countries and says, hey guys, are you tired of being in some externally controlled military alliance that a large country is running and means that if it goes to war, you go to war as well? Wouldn't you rather be in NATO, which is exactly like that, except it's the United States and not Russia? And as a final thing, and we'll get to this when we look at the leverage of the European Union, is that the region goes from, at least rhetorically speaking, international Marxism to free market fundamentalism. So there's really little time for any of these countries to transition on their own and within their own agency. And, in this sense, we can say that, sure, these countries were gifted with outside groups basically driving the car itself into the democratic promised land. But the problem that we find is that the overarching influence of exogenous variables makes those reformists at home seem little more than compliant puppets. Right? And this is something that I also will bring up when we talk about the rise of populism in many countries of Central and Southeastern Europe. But for the time being, I think that is more than enough material for everyone to digest. I know that it was a longer than usual lecture, and I'm pretty certain I've gone well beyond 90 minutes here. But the chapter markers in the description give you, little links to where you can pick up and drop off. But if you have read, especially, those who are enrolled, if you have read the Eckert, Rupnik, and Tismaniano pieces, and you've watched the documentary on 1989, and are able to now apply that to the material that's offered here in this lecture, you're going to be in good shape for the first reading evaluation. Next week, we are beginning our first specific case study coverage of Central Europe, and the first lecture is going to be really an overarching discussion that will focus on this week, on the next week and the subsequent week, on the linkage and the leverage of the European Union. So a lot of good stuff where we get to scrutinize and criticize neoliberal structural developments. But until that time, enjoy the rest of the weekend, and I will see you very, very soon. Take care, all.